To resume because we're already a few minutes behind schedule. So, kicking off the afternoon talk is Kyle Adams, who has come up with a very pithy title, Trusting Artificial Intelligence.
I learned a lesson on like the only paper I published is that the title is way too long, and so every time I talk about it, I get really frustrated. So I've learned a lesson from that, and so now I like to keep it brief, at least in the titles. So we're going to talk a little bit about trusting AI. I'll do a little bit to motivate sort of how I got here. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Philosophy here. I did my undergrad degree in pure math and then changed teams over to the arts faculty for grad school. And I'm these days mostly a philosopher of language more than anything else, so I sometimes feel like I have to explain a little bit how I wound up in writing about AI. So I'll talk a little bit about that. One of the things that we'll wind up having to do is we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what it means to trust. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot, and there's some philosophical literature that we'll talk about. We're going to talk about what makes trust sort of intimately moral on most accounts of trust, but particularly the one that I'm going to prefer in my work here. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think AI is not sort of a suitable, I guess this is a spoiler alert for the punchline of this talk. I think it's inappropriate to focus on whether or not we can trust AI. I think that's the wrong lens to look at. And for reasons that we'll get to, but basically, I think it doesn't have the right kind of moral standing to be in like trust relationships. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some possible alternatives to trust, because as has been sort of re-emphasized a couple of times, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. AI is not likely to suddenly be abandoned by everyone who has begun to work on it. So there are still some things I think we'd like to be able to say about desirable properties for it to have. And so I hope that we can sort of float around some alternatives and think about what that might look like. So the big picture, as a PhD student, we do research areas, which are these sort of long guided reading processes with instructors here. I did one of mine in AI ethics because I thought, hey, that looked pretty neat. I worked on this with Patricia Marino. We started out being really interested in some of the stuff that we've seen talked about. I think it came up a couple times yesterday, sort of like discriminatory effects of AI decision making. So ways that it like replicates sort of existing injustices in the data that it's trained on. That was sort of the motivation going in. And then the more that we read about it, the more we started to see a lot of this language about, well, we need it to be trustworthy. We need to be able to trust it. We need to make sure that properties blah, 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 to make sure that we can trust it. And so I started to think, well, trust, okay, I can see where that's maybe a desirable feature, but nobody that we had read was really giving any sort of serious attention to what it meant to trust a thing. That was just sort of a word that was used without really being interrogated. And if there's one thing philosophers are probably frustratingly good at, it's looking at a word that people are just sort of using and saying, well, what do you mean by that? Tell us more about this. What is this trust you speak of? And so that was like a sort of whole derailing side tour on what we had originally started to do that turned into the major thrust of this project. Is making sense of trust and what it might mean for us to trust AI. So in the philosophical literature about trust, which goes back to like the 1980s mostly, there's sort of a surprising lack of examination of it before that. Trust is usually characterized as being relying on somebody to do something plus a little bit extra. There's some other special thing that makes it more than merely reliance. I'm relying on this nifty little clicker to advance my slides. Doesn't necessarily mean that I trust this little clicker in any sort of profound moral way. And so that's a distinction that's very commonly made in this literature between sort of the act of merely relying on something and then trusting something. And there's a couple of different schools of thought about what that sort of secret sauce that turns reliance into trust is. There's a few different ways to think about it. First of them is sort of the school of motive accounts, and these are motives of the trustee. So an example of this is something like, I think encapsulated interest is a weird one, but I'll focus on goodwill. That goodwill becomes sort of the secret sauce, the secret ingredient of trust, is that I trust you when I'm relying on you to do something out of your goodwill towards me. That's the idea of a goodwill type account. And those are pretty popular. I tend to favor some non-motive accounts. There's a couple examples I've thrown up here, and I'll jump ahead in a second to look at the one that I prefer. And these basically are accounts that sort of hang that distinction on something that is not a motive that the trustee has. On the commitment account, it's something like behavior as if you're acting in accordance with the commitment, that sort of thing. The one that I find most interesting is this account from 1994 by a philosopher named Richard Holton, who characterizes trust in terms of a participant's stance. And so we trust some entity A, to do X. When we're relying on them, possibly to do an action, and we have this participant stance towards them, which is a way of viewing your counterpart, the object of your trusting relation, as like an agent, a human actor. It's developed based on the participant attitudes from P.F. Strawson in the 1970s, which is a point of view from which people are subject to what he calls reactive attitudes. So if I feel angry with you, that can only happen if I'm viewing you as a participant. If I feel resentment towards you, if I feel betrayed by you, which is the particularly relevant one for trust, right? One of the key hallmarks. I won't feel betrayed if the batteries die in this thing and it fails to be reliable. I might be annoyed that has happened, but I won't be shaking my fist at this, at this clicker, unless I'm doing something, Holton has a really great phrase. He describes those kinds of people as inveterate anthropomorphizers, which is just, it's not super relevant for my talk, but it's such a good turn of phrase that I just had to use it. So the idea here is that when we are viewing something that we're relying on with this kind of participant attitude, that's what constitutes trust. Strawson is originally, I won't get super into the Strawson-y stuff. I am not a scholar of Strawson by any stretch of the imagination. I have read exactly enough to make this case, and that's it. The idea of the participant stance or the participant attitude when Strawson is developing it it's an effort to reconcile a sort of causal determinism thesis with still wanting to be able to attribute moral responsibility to people. So it's sort of in an effort to bring those two things together. He says we can look at people in two ways. We can look at them as the physically determined objects governed by deterministic laws of physics that under which you are sort of locked into whatever, and that sort of is often taken to pose a problem for moral responsibility. And the participant attitude is another way we're supposed to be able to look at them. It's supposed to give us sort of another avenue, saying we are viewing you as a participant in that exchange. I'm not convinced how well it solves the problem Strawson wants it to solve, but it's super useful to me, so I'm going to run with it anyway. So that's sort of our highlight reel of the participant stance. And the idea that's sort of most important here is that makes it a very sort of moral relationship. We can look at the origins of where this participant stance is coming from. It's about moral responsibility. It's about characterizing whatever you're interacting with as in some way participating in this sort of moral system that we're engaged in. These other accounts, like if we look at the goodwill account or the commitment account that we sort of left aside, those are also very moral. So if you prefer a different account of trust, I don't know if anyone else in here has invested way too much time into reading what a bunch of people said about trust. But if you have, and you have a different preferred account of trust, you can sort of file the serial numbers up. It's moral. It's a moral relationship. That's the important bit. The possibility of moral consideration is what motivates this participant attitude. So I was preempting myself a little bit, we talked about this already. But what that means is that if we're viewing from the participant attitude and participant stance correctly, if we're doing this sort of as we, in some sense, ought to be doing, we should be using it to view moral agents. There's something, there's something, it's difficult to say if it's something I've done like morally wrong, but it seems like there's something wrong in the way I'm understanding what's happening if I get really hung up on this flicker as a moral agent. It seems like I'm behaving in a way that is maybe not, there's something not quite lining up right when I do that. And so the idea is, sort of the key takeaway, to rightly view something as a participant in the way that trust requires, we need it to be a moral agent. And AI ain't that, is the thesis here. So I find this very, very persuasively argued by Carissa Bayles in a 2020 paper called Algorithms Are Moral Zombies. And the idea here is that algorithmic decision makers, she's speaking slightly more broadly, this is sort of, 2020, this sort of slightly preempts the big AI boom. But the idea is that these things are moral zombies. They might make moral decisions. Right? If we're thinking about, so famous examples are like sentencing algorithms, right? Or the bail setting algorithms that were popular for a while. Those things are making moral decisions, they're acting in a moral way, but they have no first personal experience. So that's the zombie part here. That's a philosophical concept that rears its head every once in a while. It has no sentience, it has no means of experiencing pain, pleasure, joy, suffering, etc. We're missing Patrick, he's been talking about emotions a lot. Doesn't have that. We've heard that a lot, it's been a refrain. And that would be, I wish I could point at it right now, it's not here. So that's missing. And on Bailey's account, what happens there is that means you're missing like an internal moral lab. You have no way of reasoning about wronging somebody because you don't know what it feels like to be betrayed. You have no sort of frame of reference in which to make that decision. There's no sense of what it feels like to be harmed, and so it's, you have no way of reasoning about what it would be like to harm another person. You're missing sort of an important part of setting up that moral framework. Secondarily, this is still Bailey's. My bullets are a little weird here. You also can't meaningfully punish them. This came up a bit yesterday too. If we want to say something like, oh, well, it's, the AI is the morally responsible thing. On Bailey's account, which I again find very persuasive, what that does is makes us unable to hold people accountable. Because you then get to you can sort of outsource. It's like, oh, it wasn't me, the computer did it, don't look at me. And, you can't, hopefully no one is like a sort of hardline anti-carceral philosopher who will give me a hard time for this, but you can't throw an AI in prison. That doesn't really do anything. You could turn it off, I guess, but it seems like you're missing a lot of the ways that we would think about, like any kind of retribution for a wrong or able to hold accountable for a wrong. It seems like there's sort of an important part missing there, and that incentivizes, so if we focus on punishment of AI and treating AI as the morally responsible thing, that sort of incentivizes people to be less worried about the consequences, because it's like, oh no, they're just going to turn my program off. That's not going to splash back on me in any terrible way. They're not going to lock me up. They're going to put my computer in jail, and that's okay. So it seems to incentivize that. It seems to prevent us from holding people accountable who we might want to hold accountable. And so there's a couple of good reasons. One sort of I guess, there's one sort of direct argument and one kind of counter argument here, right? We should not think of them this way because here are some theoretical considerations, and then there's another one, we shouldn't think of them this way because if we do, here's some bad stuff that's gonna happen. So we got a couple of different lines of argument converging on basically, don't think that they're moral agents. And that turns out to be a problem for us. So I moved ahead a little bit too soon. Those are the pieces, is that in order to sort of properly engage in a trust relationship with somebody, we need them, I'm anthropomorphizing a little bit, we would need that thing to be a moral participant. AI is not a moral participant, therefore, the thesis of the whole thing, it should really, my trusting artificial intelligence title is, I guess it's a little bit misleading. It should probably be not trusting artificial intelligence. But that was a whole extra word and I was, brevity. I feel like I pull a bait and switch every time I give this talk. So the idea basically is that we should not be engaging in trust relationships with them. I'm going to take a little digression here to talk about some incomplete thoughts I have recently had about this. This is the work in progress part of this talk. Because this is an epiphany that I had on Wednesday. So I have not had a lot of time to flesh it out. It's happened in conversation with Nick Ray, who's a philosopher in our department. I work with him as his TA this semester. And he's TAing a moral issues course. And in that course, he's got one big theme, right? The whole thing, no one here is in that class, I can give it away. There's one big theme, which is that it's wrong to treat people like they're objects. Bad to do that. That's generally a bad thing to do to people. And so that I was pretty on board with. Seems like not a great thing to do. And so then I got thinking about like, well, what is wrong with that, and what if we sort of flip that around? What about treating objects as if they are people, sort of wrongly? And that then led me to this sort of half-formed thought about like trusting AI involving treating objects like people in an inappropriate way. Does it sort of hold us to that? If it does, is that a problem? There's some ways in which it seems like that's maybe not a problem, right? If I, at least not a moral problem. We'll go back to my favorite object today, the Logitech clicker. If I tuck the Logitech clicker into bed every night and say, have a sweet dreams, buddy, I'm treating it kind of like a person. It might seem weird, but it doesn't necessarily seem like morally bad. And so I was trying to figure out in what ways I thought that this might concern us. I've got a couple sort of half-formed thoughts that you're all going to be subject to, so thank you. One of them is an article from, again, 2020 by a guy named John P. Sullins, who argues that it's about trusting robots. And his position is that robots could be designed to exploit pro-social tendencies which humans have. How many people, it's probably not everybody, but it's certainly a lot of people. It's very easy to like anthropomorphize something like Alexa, who very cheerfully is like, the weather today, it's hard to not feel some kind of human participation thing happening there. And the idea that Sullins advances is that robots can be designed to do this, and they are. And he suggests this could be exploitative. By sort of fostering these sort of inappropriately trusting relationships. Alexa does not work for you, she works for Jeff Bezos. And so you get these sort of strange, potentially exploitative relationships. My other sort of recent thought, I've messed up my bulleting again, that should be back out as its own thing. One of the thoughts that I have is that might do weird, like if we start treating these object classes of things as if they're people, that might do weird things to our moral reasoning, right? You can imagine, this is something that comes up in ethics stuff all the time, is like how do you compare the interests of certain non-human things. So sometimes it's animals, sometimes it's like, the Mona Lisa. Do you rescue the Mona Lisa from a burning building or like a person? Which of those is more important to save? I think that, treating robots or artificially intelligent software as if it is a person could, do similar strange things to our moral reasoning. I'm not sure exactly where that's going. That's just a thought that I had. I don't know if I want to go like, I don't know exactly where I want to go with that, but it's a thought. It lives up here. Now it's up there. So those are some of the incomplete sort of where this goes next kind of things that I'm thinking about. The other thing that I said I would give you, which I guess I had better stick to my plan here, is it's not going anywhere. We've I think established that pretty conclusively. So one thing I wanted to make sure I was thinking about a little bit is like, what are some other ways we might kind of trust AI? Even if we think trust is inappropriate, what that is an appropriate measure to look at. There's a couple different things we can do. Earlier, I have thought that it might be fine to just merely rely. That seems like at least an important benchmark, right? If it's not doing the thing that it's supposed to do, that does seem like a reason for concern. I think that's, hopefully that's uncontroversial. We would want it to be able to do the thing that it tells us it's going to do. Another thing that we might consider is like proxy trust in the creators. I'm a little skeptical about this one. I don't know that I trust, like, I don't know, Sam Altman as far as I can throw him. I don't know him personally. This is not a, I'm sure he's a really great guy. But it seems to me like that's a move that you could maybe make in some cases, but not in others, right? There's lots of people who are interested in creating AI for lots of different reasons, and some of them are going to be, some of them are probably going to be more trustworthy than others. But it is an avenue that I don't want to rule out as something that might possibly license something closer to a trusting relationship. And that is, I think, my 25-ish minutes, and also my slides. So good timing me. Thank you, everyone.